It's inevitable for games to take ideas from their predecessors, since the foundations that have been established by older games can potentially be reused. Why spend time trying to come up with a foundation of your own when you can just take what somebody else has done and use it to build an entirely new experience? Derivative game design is certainly a valid strategy for making games. However, I feel that most developers these days see it as the only way to make games, and to be honest, I kind of see why. We live in an era where publishers refuse to take risks on new, unproven concepts, and expect everything to be derivative. Then you have indie developers who want to make the next Metroid or the next Zelda game. It's all the same really. The only difference between these two types of developer is that indies are far more likely to base their game off of niche franchises, whereas AAA developers are more likely to use popular franchises as influences. Both developers suffer from the same problem, however, and that is what has led to an era of what many call spiritual successors. Now, it's no secret that I am a fan of the 6th console generation of gaming. Back then, we had all kinds of games for different tastes, many of which took risks. Some paid off, some didn't. It was a very exciting time to be a gamer back then, and it is because game developers were all trying to make focused games. Back then, publishers were willing to consider the opportunity for those games to thrive in the market. Nowadays, however, publishers have reached a point of complacency. Now there's no reason for them to take risks, since the payoff isn't worth it like it used to be, since game publishers didn't have the luxury of microtransactions back then, so they had to make sure that the games were good or fans would stop buying from them. Back then, many of us didn't have the internet, so finding out about new games was considerably more difficult. If you wanted to get a new game, you had to go to a game store and judge a game based on the cover and what was advertised on the back of the box. Either that, or word of mouth influenced what games were worth playing and what weren't. Word of mouth was the biggest deciding factor for many. Therefore, it was important for developers to make the games not only eye-catching, but fun to play, so that people would recommend them to friends. Nowadays, we live in a world where the media is constantly in your face and information is easier to consume than ever. Companies have taken advantage of this by over-marketing their game to the point that people can't not talk about it. I mean, how many Raid Shadow Legends advertisements do you see nowadays? Sure, it's considered a joke at this point for being overly marketed, but that hasn't stopped people from talking about it, and when people talk about it, people get curious. It's human nature to want to see things for yourself, to experience what everyone else is talking about so that you can be part of the discussion. This is why games today are generally dogshit, because publishers know that you can easily make a mediocre product and shove trailers and other marketing related tat in people's faces, then let the consumers do most of the marketing for you by hyping the game up. Just give a Twitch streamer a free game and they will not only tell their viewers about it, but both they and their viewers will broadcast it on social media, which goes for a huge web of followers. I see it all the time, people. Everyone I follow on Twitter retweets and likes stuff that gets sent to me. Why does Twitter have to show me all of this bullcrap? I don't need to see people talking about Monster Hunter Rise all day, but unfortunately, since it's the biggest thing to come out recently, that's all people talk about. You cannot escape it. It's literally all over the internet everywhere you go. The only way to escape it is to turn off the internet, but if I did that, then I couldn't be doing what I do now. My point is that game development strategies have changed over the years. We have to accept that we are never ever going to have a console generation as good as the 6th console generation. So with that in mind, please stop trying to bring back those games with your spiritual successors, because all it will do is make people compare your game to the game that it is based on, and it is almost certain that people will consider the game to be inferior to the game they played years ago. The only way we can solve this problem is by looking back to how derivative game design worked back in the day. The best example of this would be Painkiller, a game that to this day I cannot find another game in the genre worthy of being anything close to the same experience. Yet its mechanics are clearly derivative from other games in the genre, those games being Quake and Serious Sam. It goes without saying that the director of Painkiller is a huge Quake fan, and naturally that led to his game being heavily influenced by Quake. Unlike Quake, however, the game also features large open arenas with large groups of enemies as opposed to Quake's more maze-like level structure. This is something that was previously seen in Serious Sam, however, Serious Sam did its own thing, and it isn't really comparable to Painkiller outside of this one thing. Despite the movement of Quake and the level design of Serious Sam, Painkiller managed to distinguish itself from other games in the genre. How did it do that, you ask? Well, that's simple. In the behind-the-scenes video of Painkiller's development, the developers talk about how fans were displeased by the lack of weapons available to them. The director claims that from an abstract standpoint, there were actually more than just 5 weapons, they just combined them into other weapons. The reason for this likely has to do with the hotkeys and ease of use, something that developers back in the day weren't thinking of. Thanks to this fantastic design choice, there are only 5 hotkeys that players need to cycle between. Though Bow Out of Hell added 2 more weapons, making that 7, they still have multiple functions, making the weapon cycling a lot easier than it would have been if the weapons were all separated. This one design choice alone greatly differentiated the experience from Quake and Serious Sam, as it felt considerably tighter and easier to pick up and play as a result, without neglecting the importance of flexibility. That is why Painkiller is the absolute best of the 3 games, if you ask me, because it managed to neutralise what was needless input complexity. Any game that can minimise the amount of buttons needed to play the game, while still maintaining the flexibility necessary to make the gameplay varied enough to be fun, is deserving of praise, as that is what all game developers need to strive to achieve, and it is one of the many problems that game developers are meant to solve. It's how game developers manage to circumvent these problems that ultimately makes games so fun and interesting to study, and what can ultimately make them stand out from other games. Of course, there are many other factors such as theme and pacing that come into play too, but all of that is for nothing if game developers fail to solve the problems presented to them. When games are entirely derivative, the desire to solve becomes non-existent, because an entirely derivative game strives to solve nothing. It is important to take inspiration from games of old, but it is also important to have a good understanding of what it is you wish to achieve with those ideas, as opposed to doing the exact same thing just because it worked for that game, so it will work again for this game. It's this mindset that is stagnating our games, and it is partially due to how publishers treat games like throwaway swag toys that are made to cash in on impulse buyers, and the games of the modern era, that many indie developers have completely forgotten the ability to distinguish their own games from others. The ability and the willpower to solve problems and bring games to life through a web of solutions is what game designers are meant to do. Not create dream worlds and make similar experience to older games. That's not game design. By doing that, video games can never truly evolve. When we, the consumers, play games, we look for the dream worlds. We look for the thematic style because that's ultimately what catches our interest. Game developers should never look at their own games the same way we do. They should only see things on an abstract level, and I think this is ultimately what separates the men from the boys when it comes to game design, because believe me, if I was capable at designing games at an abstract level and was skilled at programming, I wouldn't be wasting my life away making this content. I'd just be making games myself, but the reality is that there are people out there that are better than me at that. The thing is though that there are countless people who have learned coding, learned how to make assets, and know how to use game engines, but they haven't got a clue about what game design actually is. Yet we see these people making games all the time, and while it's great and all that they're willing to put time and effort into these things, the results generally don't leave a lasting impression on people, and this is the reason why. So to summarise my point, derivative design has its place, but it's not the be-all and end-all of game development. I'm not telling people to make their games entirely unique, because I'm very well aware that it's not only difficult to do, but it also isn't viable. You should come up with your own vision first, a vision that is both pragmatic and is able to see games from an abstract standpoint. Then you need to come up with methods to make things work, even if it means taking design ideas from other games to do this. Just don't take design ideas for the sake of it, and actually think about the implications of such a design choice before you choose to add it. Of course, coming up with your own methods is always encouraged, but if an older game found an easier way to do it, use that method instead. I'll see you guys next time.